Hi, everyone, and welcome to Tell Me About Podcast, where each week two nerdy friends deep dive random topics. I'm Laura,
And I'm Tom.
and this is episode number 29.
So we want to thank you for sticking with us. We appreciate you, and we appreciate you always hanging around and listening to us and giving us feedback. Just to let you know, we are going to be alternating weeks starting with this episode. This is the April and May we kind of talked about that we're going to need to do for the next couple weeks. So we'll have podcasts on the 17th. May 1st, we'll have a podcast. Basically, we're going to be recording when we can. Be patient with us, stay with us, especially in Belgium. We know we're new in Belgium, so we see you, Belgium. We appreciate you. Hang with us. We will get you more of that content you love as soon as we can.
So today we're continuing our look back at Back to the Future with part 2. So Tom, how do you feel about part 2 of this trilogy?
I liked part 1 better. You had told me it gets a little dark, and I don't think I realized how dark it gets. I don't necessarily go for, I'm not a huge fan of movies where it starts off really light and then it gets like incredibly dark. Like I kind of want to have an expectation of what the movie's going to be going in. I liked it. I liked the first one more. I thought, and we're going to get into this, I thought the first one was a more consistent story. One of the issues I had about this is that, not to say that it felt like they were being forced to do this as a cash grab, but this felt like, you can kind of tell that the studio told them they had to make it. It felt like a lot of things were kind of written in because they were trying to tie it. They were trying to create as many or answer as many questions as they could. And so I think what happens is you kind of have things that's kind of a jumbled mess. And we're going to talk about, the casting in a minute here, before we get into it. But some of it felt very messy, and some of it felt very complicated, and some of it felt very, I'm going to say the word forced a lot. Some of it felt very forced. I don't know if you would agree with that or not, because I know you really like too.
I actually really like part 2, and I think I like it as much as, if not more than part 1. I do very much like the dark aspect of it. I like seeing 3 different time points. And I really think it was cool to see Marty like going back and seeing himself and trying to avoid himself. I do see your point about it being a bit messy, and I don't necessarily know that I would say forced. Zemeckis and Gale did agree to it. I don't think that they didn't want to do it. I just think that this is the story they wanted to tell. I just think it was too much for one movie.
Yeah, and I would say in some places I think they tried too hard to kind of tie things into other things, to previous things. Again, if you had made this, if there had been 4 movies instead of 3, or 5 movies instead of 3, this probably would have been a little smoother. I could almost kind of see this now not being a 3-movie trilogy, but like a 5-part miniseries in today's world, like limited series.
And you could have put more time into, like, let's say the future timeline, and only had maybe 2 different time points in this instead of going to 3 different ones. So yeah, I could see that, but Zemeckis and Gale very much didn't want to do more than 3. So I think they really tried to put in as much as they could.
Well, I'm not saying that was the wrong decision. I'm saying in today's world, I don't necessarily know if this is a 3-movie trilogy. I think you maybe have the first movie, maybe a second, or you honestly have the first movie and then like a 4 or 5-part like Netflix series where you can kind of just flesh everything out in its own like contained episode, and try to build to like an endpoint. Now the flip side would also then probably be at that point that you can keep basically refreshing the story with new characters. and where you're not necessarily replacing or recasting them, but it's like you're basically just like how you're creating alternate timelines, you're creating just alternate stories that you can go off to under the moniker. But that's really more of a question about just modern media and the way like movies and things are consumed more than really about this specifically.
All right, are you ready to get into it?
I am.
Released on November 22nd, 1989, Back to the Future Part 2 is the second installment of the trilogy and has received mixed reviews. It's been deemed inferior to Part 1, but was generally more liked by audiences than critics. Audiences already knew and loved these characters, and they were much more invested in the storyline. Critics' main complaint was that the movie was uneven and had an overstuffed plot. Roger Ebert said that it was lacking the genuine power of the original, but praised the slapstick humor and the hoverboard chase sequence, which is one of my favorite parts of the movie, giving it 3 out of 4 stars. It has 62% on Rotten Tomatoes, which is the lowest of all 3 movies, but it also has an 85% audience score. So you can see the difference in the higher audience score versus the overall score. So if that tells you anything.
I don't necessarily put a lot of stock into a critic's analysis of it. I think a lot of things can be pointed just to be pointed and are not necessarily not honest, but not true critiques of the work. Being a critic, whether it's an art critic, a movie critic, a music critic, what have you, it's an art form. There's a fine line between being an objective critic that can look at a movie or a film with an independent eye and deliver pointed analysis of the strengths and weaknesses, and a critic who is being an ass just to be an ass, just because it's edgy and it's their quote unquote brand. See every Pitchfork album review in the last 15 years. But it's a good movie. It's not the first. But then again, with maybe the exception of the second Godfather or The Empire Strikes Back, it is extremely hard to have a sequel be as good as the original. Very few sequels are ever going to have the cultural impact of the first one, whether it's in terms of the story or the characters or the performances.
As we mentioned last episode, because of the success of the first movie, Universal very much wanted to make a sequel. Robert Zemeckis and Bob Gale were told that the sequel was going to be made with or without them, and so they agreed. They wanted to redefine what a sequel was for Part 2, and Bob Gale talked about how people tend to want the same movie as the first one, but just a little bit different, so that's what they made. The first script they wrote combined both Part 2 and 3, and was 180 pages long and would have had a 3.5-hour runtime. Universal agreed to separate the two, making 2 sequels that were filmed back-to-back, which was a first for the industry. They cut a trailer at the end of Part 2 for Part 3 to ensure audiences a third movie was coming to wrap up everything after the cliffhanger at the end of Part 2.
I was about to say when I saw that, I was very confused why an entire new cast was being introduced at the end of the movie. I'm like, did they already shoot this? That's a pretty impressive feat to have essentially an entire new movie on top of what you've already made. That's pretty impressive. If for no other reason that it is a real test to the human, to the physical will of the actors, because that had to be an absolute bitch of a filming schedule. Like they were already talking about, Michael J. Fox was being run ragged at the end of the first one.
Part 2 was originally supposed to be set in the 60s, prior to Marty's birth, with Lorraine as a flower child protesting the Vietnam War, and George as a college professor at Berkeley. They abandoned the idea and went for the storyline about going into the future, though Zemeckis was concerned that portraying the future would have wildly inaccurate predictions, and some of them were.
I mean, he got the rampant commercialism down pat. That they nailed.
They also included an alternate 1985 with a more dark, apocalyptic theme to it. Bob Gale really liked the idea of bringing a dark element to the storyline, relating it to The Empire Strikes Back, but he said that audiences weren't prepared for it in this franchise. The second film also deviates from the other two in that it is jumping around more in the timeline, where Part 1 and Part 3 are stuck in one time period and they're trying to get back to the present day. They also added the element of going back to the storyline of Part 1, which was also a groundbreaking concept that had never been done before. Zemeckis and Gale wanted to be able to go back to the first movie and see it from a different angle, recreating it to form another storyline. To achieve this, Zemeckis and Gale had to incorporate special effects that were never used before. The visual effects studio Industrial Light and Magic, or ILM, was used for digital compositing, as well as a motion control camera system, which allowed an actor to be portrayed as multiple characters simultaneously on the screen. So the scenes with 2 Biffs, 2 Martys, 2 Docs, that's how they did this. There is a behind-the-scenes shot of this camera moving on a track by itself, and Zemeckis explaining that a computer memorized the images and allowed for the perfect playback of that scene each time. They loved the technology because they were determined to get those scenes right. Technology has advanced quite a bit since then, but at the time, this was a new and ingenious way to achieve the scenes that they wanted. It was pretty groundbreaking for 1989.
And if you're wondering what kind of a outfit Industrial Light and Magic is, it was founded by a guy named George Lucas. And it was founded in 1975. What movie did George Lucas come out with that was started in the 70s? This is the company that basically helped make Star Wars. They know what they're doing from a visual effects standpoint.
With a budget of $40 million, it took 2 years to finish building the sets and writing the scripts before shooting could begin. Back to the Future 2 began filming in February of 1989, and it took 11 months to film both movies. Prior to the release, there was a billboard featuring Marty looking at his watch, counting down the premiere to Part 2, which I thought was absolutely ingenious and brilliant and one of the best marketing and advertisements ever.
There were a couple of them that are like really iconic. Like I think of the cracking egg from Alien. You know, the Independence Day poster was always, with the spaceship was iconic. This one was really creative, and this was like really, if you think about it, movie posters, they were really the first viral marketing. A lot of times you would decide whether or not you wanted to see a movie based on, if you didn't get a chance to see the trailer in the theater, you decided if you wanted to see it based on the poster, maybe the commercial. They had to be creative to get people in. And this was really a creative way of doing it.
After its premiere in November of 1989, Part 2 grossed $332 million and was the third highest grossing movie of that year. The movie was released on VHS in May of 1990 and was released on DVD in 2002 as a part of a trilogy set. Most of the cast returned for Part 2 and 3, and Zemeckis and Gale would only agree to write the films if Fox and Lloyd agreed to come back, which they did fairly quickly. Family Ties was ending as the filming of Part 2 began, so there was only about a 2-week overlap period for Michael J. Fox. Now, there are 2 casting changes that we do need to talk about. First, which is pretty obvious, is Jennifer. At the time, Claudia Wells had quit acting to care for her mother, who was dying of cancer. She was replaced with Elizabeth Shue, and there is a fan theory that Marty did something in the past that changed her parents or her parents' relationship, and that explains why she looks different. Now, my argument against this, though, is she was the same at the end of Part 1, so that wouldn't really explain it.
It's one of the leaps in logic that the film kind of makes you perform, because you're right. She looks the same at the end of the first movie.
It's lesser known that Crispin Glover did not return as George McFly. I alluded to the story in our episode covering Part 1, and things got quite contentious between Glover and Zemeckis and Gale. When they reached out to Glover for Part 2 and 3, he, according to them, demanded way too much money to participate in the film. Glover says that he wasn't asking for anything unreasonable and it was on par with what Leah Thompson and Tom Wilson were getting paid. They declined to meet his demands and hired Jeffrey Weissman to replace him. They wanted to minimize showing Jeffrey on screen in an effort for character continuity. This is why Jeffrey is hanging upside down in the future arc, so that audiences couldn't really see his face. Though Zemeckis and Gale argue that George hanging upside down was already in the script when Glover was replaced. They also killed off George in the alternate 1985 arc to avoid having to shoot scenes with George in that era. They did use his image for the newspaper story, though. When it came to the return of the 1955 arc, it did present some challenges. Zemeckis and Gale were able to reuse some of the footage from the first movie to show George at the dance. For other scenes that showed the arc from a different angle, they blurred Jeffrey Weissman, used long shot camera angles, and shot him from the back or side. They also used prosthetics on his face to make him look more like Crispin Glover, and it actually looks really creepy. Now, I do have a picture of this, and I'm going to show you the two side by side. This one is Crispin Glover, and then that's Jeffrey with the prosthetics on his face. To me, he looks a little bit like Jigsaw from Saw with that, his face looks puffy. He
looks like he's wearing a wooden mask of himself.
Yeah. And then that's another one just of him. And if you look up close on his cheeks, you can see the outline of the prosthetics. Do you see that?
It looks like he's about to lure me into the sewers with a thing of balloons.
It's a bit creepy.
You know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of Vincent D'Onofrio in Men in Black after he gets eaten by the alien and he's wearing the Edgar suit and he's trying to act human.
After the movie came out, Glover really didn't like the performance of Weissman and was pissed that they reused his image without his permission. He filed a lawsuit against Zemeckis and Gale and won, which led to changes in the industry around how filmmakers use the likenesses of actors in their movie. Glover still holds a grudge about it to this day, and he does not want to be associated with the trilogy whatsoever. He declines any invitation to participate in cast interviews and has become a bit paranoid about Gale in particular being out to get him. He thinks that Weissman was told to act more hokey in order to make a mockery of his character. Gale denies this. Glover has worked on other projects since then, but nothing as successful as Back to the Future. What do you think about that whole argument and the lawsuit?
So this was part of what the Actors Guild was fighting for when they, with the strike last year. There had been a proposal, I think, and I don't know if this was just with extras or I don't know if with actors in the guild, where basically the studios had proposed that they would be able to use an AI likeness of an actor. They'd make a scan of them once and be able to use them in perpetuity without having to pay them royalties, which I don't know how they thought that was going to go, where they thought that was going to go, or how they were going to agree to that. But that's kind of what they were doing here. Now, I will give the filmmakers, I think, benefit of the doubt, because I don't, when I say filmmakers, I say Zemeckis and Gale. I don't think it was necessarily their call. That seems like something that would come from above. That's the type of thing an executive would do.
I would agree with you. And just, again, I don't know them. I don't know what was in their heads at the time. But seeing interviews with them, I don't think there was anything nefarious behind it. I think they were really just trying to put out the best movie with the most continuity that they could.
When you don't have that, you have to be creative to get around it. It's almost like eco-conservation in a sense, because everything has a purpose, and there's no wasted scenes. Everything has a purpose, and everything was used and reused and repurposed in different ways to move things along. Yes, they have the right to use that footage. Now, I think the question becomes, are you using it just to get around hiring the actor or paying royalties, which is where I think Crispin has an argument. Well, obviously he had a winning argument. The judge ruled in I don't know if it was a judge or a jury, but they ruled in his favor and they awarded him damages. So obviously it was a compelling argument. We don't know any of these people personally, so I cannot speak to what their mental state was or what they were thinking. Personally, without knowing anything else, I could see that's how he won.
I did watch an interview with him telling his story. It was more about that they used his image and his likeness without his permission. So even if they did credit him, they didn't get his permission. Something that I find really sad about this is how he won't participate in any interviews or like cast activities. And I get that. I understand why he won't. But I was watching something recently where it was over lockdown for COVID. And I think it was Josh Gad, I want to say, got all the actors together. And I think got Bob Gale with the group. And I forget who else was there. But it's just they seem to have so much love and affection for each other. And it's just a shame that he's not part of that.
It also depends on what his relationship is with the other actors. Because there are a lot of actors that, once they're done on a project, they don't want to be involved with it anymore.
I got the sense that, and I talked about this in our last episode, how he was super hard to direct. I think he was hard to act in a scene with. So I think that he kind of was almost like the black sheep of that movie. So I don't know how much love is lost between him and the other characters. They seem very tight-knit, but I think it was Tom Wilson did an interview and basically said, I haven't talked to him since.
And you kind of see it in the movie, like he doesn't really have a lot of chemistry with anyone else. There's not really a lot of natural flow with any of his scenes. Like I said, I just don't know what kind of relationship he would have had with any of them anyway.
You ready to get into the movie?
Yes, I'm ready to get into it.
Our opening scene is a shot-for-shot remake of the ending of Part 1. Now, there are some subtle differences in their movements, and the license plate on Marty's black truck is different. As they fly off to the year 2015, Biff witnesses the time machine take off as he was running out to show Marty his new matchbooks for his auto detailing company. He remarks, "What the hell is going on here?" I would have thought the same thing, honestly, if I saw a flying car. I want to point out Doc's see-through tie in this scene as well, and the barcode license plate that is now on the DeLorean. I just thought those were really cool details.
It's supposed to be futuristic, but a see-through tie seems very 80s.
Now, some fans point out that Doc could have just told Marty what will happen in the future with his kids and how to avoid it, but you wouldn't have a plot of a movie.
Well, that gets back to, I think they kind of ended the first one expecting that was going to be the only one.
As they travel to 2015, they almost hit a flying taxi. And you can see that traffic is still somewhat traveling within lanes, even in the air. Marty asks, where are they and when are they? Doc confirms that they are in Hill Valley, California, which I don't think is mentioned explicitly in the first movie, but you had pointed out to me that it's on the license plates, which I didn't notice.
They mention Hill Valley. They don't mention where Hill Valley is. I think but the license plates have California on them.
Doc says the date is October 21st, 2015. They tell Jennifer that they are in a time machine, and as she's trying to wrap her mind around it and asking questions, Doc knocks her out with some sort of device. He says that she'll be fine and that she's not essential to his plan. Now, at the end of Part 1, Doc encourages Marty to bring Jennifer along, and now she's in the way. As I mentioned in our previous episode, Zemeckis and Gale regretted the decision of having her in the time machine at the end of Part 1. At the time, they didn't know that they were going to make a sequel, as we said, and when they started writing Part 2, they really didn't know what to do with her. As they are flying, there are multiple floating traffic signs, one noting where the courthouse is, and another is the Hill Valley Town sign, which has some changes to it. It goes back to saying a nice place to live, like it did in 1955, and it now notes, please fly safely, with the line, "Ejection seats save lives."
Yes, they do.
We also see that Goldie Wilson Jr. is now the mayor. And Zemeckis said that these signs were really difficult to put together and appear floating, so I can imagine. I also want to randomly point out that Doc is wearing two watches, and I think it was to show his obsession with time, so I had never noticed that before.
I didn't even notice that when I watched it. That's really interesting. That's a good pickup.
Now, Zemeckis and Gale knew some of their predictions about the future were going to be wrong, and they contend that it wasn't an attempt to be an accurate depiction of the future. In 2010, Zemeckis said that the future arc was his least favorite part of the movie, as he hates movies with future predictions. Though he does think they got it about 50% right. I don't know if it was 50%. I would say maybe 30 to 40% right, but I don't know. What do you think about it?
He got the rampant commercialism, having corporations run everything and being bombarded with ads in every phase of life. That he got. I am pissed we don't have hoverboards or flying cars.
They knew that flying cars were not going to be a thing, and to this day, like you, Zemeckis is very upset that we still don't have flying cars.
Any car could be airborne if you really, really wanted to.
Unlike other movies, they wanted to depict a more optimistic look forward into the future. The props for this arc were much bigger and more expensive, with 27 people staffed in the prop department in Part 2 and 3. We see them landing in the time machine in 2015, where the weather is more accurately predicted. The rain stops and the skies clear up instantly. Doc gets out and you see a Fusion Industry sign behind in the background, which is a nod to the upgraded fueling system on the DeLorean. We see Doc peeling off his skin as a part of a skin rejuvenation that he had done. Now, the real reason they wrote this in was so Christopher Lloyd didn't have to wear prosthetics throughout the movie. Now, this must have been really painful peeling this off, though. And I remember back, I want to say this was early 2000s, there was a very popular mask where after it dried, you literally like peeled it off your face, and it was so painful to do. So this very much reminded me of that. And you can actually still see some of it stuck on his face in a close-up in this scene. So they didn't quite get all of it.
Also, too, like I was going to say about the weather is that couldn't you also argue that the weather was accurate because Christopher Lloyd had just come back from the future, so he would know when the rain would stop?
Yeah, but he made a comment that the weather is more accurately predicted in the future. So I think for both reasons, yeah.
Also, too, that kind of had to suck for the makeup artist who just spent all that time putting it on him just to have him rip it off on camera after like 10 minutes.
Doc hands Marty a cylindrical Nike sneaker box and tells him to change his clothes. Doc uses modern binoculars to see a younger Marty bumbling through town, and you see a shot of this AT&T payphone, which is, for everything that has changed between 89 and 2015, like, payphones weren't something that stayed, but it was neat to see that. Marty puts on the sneakers that Doc gave him, which have power laces. Now, people loved these sneakers when the movie came out, and Nike released a version of these shoes in July of 2008 called Air Mags, and they were nicknamed Air McFly after Marty. They weren't self-lacing, though. There are a few other iterations of self-lacing shoes, but only limited quantities were sold in 2015 and 2016. Tom, do you want to guess how much they sold for?
I would say at least $6,000.
They were priced at $13,000 a pair. So those were some pricey sneakers.
The 6 is what you got them on Primark for about 2 years later.
Now, to achieve the effect in the movie of the self-lacing shoes, they put the sneakers on a piece of fake asphalt with wires in them, and somebody would pull the wire through the bottom to lace them. So I thought that was pretty ingenious.
That's kind of how you had to do a lot of these visual effects back in the 80s was, a lot of wires and cables and things like that. If you ever want to see, it's really interesting. It's really interesting to see, like, for example, how they made E.T. And even how they made like that commercial sequel, Christmas sequel to ET was. Like they show how they use the wires to control him and the anima. It's really kind of interesting to see how they were able to use these wires to make it seem very seamless.
Marty also puts on the self-adjusting jacket too, where similar effects with wires were used. Doc advises him to pull out his pockets, as kids these days wear their clothes inside out. He also hands him a colorful, shiny hat to wear. They dump a still passed out Jennifer in the alley, and Doc tells Marty to go to Cafe 80s, which is, as he says, one of those nostalgic places that's not done very well, which we will see that it's not. He gives him $50 to buy a Pepsi, pretty pricey for a soda, and to wait for Griff to tell him that he's out of participating in his scheme. Some fans thought that it was a bit misogynistic of Zemeckis and Gale to leave Jennifer in the alley while the boys go off and play. But again, I just feel like they didn't know what to do with her character, and this was kind of their solution. Other fans argue that they could have just left her in the car, which was also a good point, so I don't know.
It feels like they spent half this movie dumping her somewhere. The tagline just seems to be, just leave her there. She'll be fine.
Now, Doc says not to talk or interact with anyone or look at anything. That's kind of impossible, especially if you're in the future world of what you live in and everything's different and you want to take everything in. Like, kind of impossible, Doc, but okay.
Also, you're gonna draw attention to yourself if you're going, can't see you, no.
Doc finally shows him the newspaper headline to explain why they're there. Marty McFly Jr. arrested for theft. Youth gang denies complicity. He says within 2 hours, Marty Jr. was tried and convicted as the justice system works more swiftly because they abolished all lawyers. So that one hurt, Tom, didn't it?
Well, I mean, it'd be yet another degree where I incurred hundreds of thousands of dollars in student loans for absolutely no reason.
A week later, Marty's daughter tries to break his son out of jail and gets 20 years in prison. This sequence of events will destroy Marty's whole family. Before Marty leaves to meet Griff, Doc warns him to be careful, as Griff has a few short circuits in his bionic implant, which I thought was really funny. Before we move on to the next scene, I want to point out a few things from the newspaper. At the top left, there is a mention that slam ball playoffs will begin, a new sport that was supposed to be covered in the movie but wasn't, though you can see another subtle mention to it later.
This is also completely different from the actual slam ball, which is literally just basketball with trampolines and tackling.
Another headline says, Washington prepares for Queen Diana's visit, because of course they didn't know about her divorce from Charles or her untimely death yet. Another headline says, President says she's tired, alluding to a female president in the future. And the last headline I want to mention is Thumb Bandits Strike, amputating thumbs of hospital patients. Now the explanation for this is that in 2015, or in this version of 2015, people pay for items using their thumbprints, and these criminals were essentially stealing their payment methods. That was an interesting headline.
If you've ever seen Minority Report, people use their eye scanners to gain entry to places, and you kind of see a version of this where like people get like black market eye transplants.
Nope, don't want an eye transplant. The USA Today newspaper notes 3 billion readers to show how the population has grown, and it now costs $6 due to inflation. Now, I thought all of those were really nice details, most of which I've never noticed before.
And they got the inflation right.
Yeah. As Marty ventures out into Hill Valley, you see the clothes of the future, very colorful with loud patterns and shapes. And you see 2 people walking with a hover surfboard, and the futuristic cars. Some, I noticed, looked a little bit like Teslas. There is a no landing sign painted on the road, and off to the right, there is a takeoff and landing ramp next to the courthouse. We also see the evolution of the Texaco station, which is present in all 3 time points. As Marty walks around, we see the movie theater, now called Holomax, advertising Jaws 19 with the tagline, "This time it's really, really personal," which was directed by Max Spielberg, one of Spielberg's sons. The 3D shark hologram scares the shit out of Marty when it comes out to bite him, although he replies, "Shark still looks fake." Goldie Wilson III pops up on the screen behind Marty, advertising hovercar conversions. It shows this pink car in the ad, and then if you look closely, you can see that same car drive by just like seconds later. Marty then sees Cafe 80s as well as an antique store that he'll come back to. I want to point out a few things that I noticed in the antique store window that I thought were cool. A Jaws movie poster, a lava lamp, a bust of JFK, a Roger Rabbit doll, which is a nod to Zemeckis, who was also the director of that film. There's also a typewriter, a dustbuster, a clothes iron, an antique computer, and a VHS video camera, which is the same model that Marty had in part 1. Lastly, it's tough to see, but there's a jean jacket in the window, which was the same one that Marty wore in the first movie. As Marty walks into Cafe 80s, it looks both nostalgic and futuristic. He sees these video, and I'm going to try to say this right, simulacrums is how I saw it referred to it in the research, of Michael Jackson and Ronald Reagan, both of whom loved part 1 of the trilogy. They used a Michael Jackson lookalike in the film, who is going over the menu with another patron when Marty walks in. He sees people on exercise bikes, eating, a moving TV, taking orders from people in the booths, and then Marty is greeted by the simulacrum of Reagan and the Ayatollah Khomeini, which then glitches pretty badly. He says, "All I want is a Pepsi," and a Pepsi Perfect pops up from the counter, which I thought was cool. Pepsi released a limited edition of Pepsi Perfect in October of 2015 to coincide with the date when Marty is in the future. Do you remember Pepsi Perfect?
I actually don't. And me being a soda snob, I thought I probably would have gotten it, but I did not.
We see old Biff sitting there in a lot of prosthetics, and he says, "Hey, McFly." He tells Marty that his dad, meaning him, is a butthead and a loser and flushed his life down the toilet, giving some context to the 2015 Marty. Griff, Biff's grandson, pulls up in a flying car with his goons in the background, similar to Biff in 1955 in part 1. Griff pulls Biff out of the diner, complaining about the coats of wax on his car. Now, a lot of fans wonder, when the hell did Biff have a kid, right? Like, based on part 1, didn't seem like he was real lovable or in a relationship or anything like that. But I guess he did have a kid. And then that kid had a kid.
Congrats to Biff. Biff fucked.
Marty, waiting for Griff to return, goes up to the Wild Gunman arcade game and shows 2 young kids how to play it. One of the kids is a very young Elijah Wood, and this was his first on-screen role of his career. The kids are really unimpressed, saying that it's a baby's toy because you have to use your hands. Wild Gunman was an actual video game by Nintendo, but there was never an arcade version made of it, and the original looks slightly different. The real Marty Jr. comes into the cafe looking super dopey. He kind of looks high to me, in my opinion. Like, he just had a few tokes before he walked in, but as Griff comes back in as well, while the real Marty hides behind the counter, Griff presses Marty Jr. about participating in his scheme, while him and his goons intimidate him and rough him up. The real Marty says that Marty Jr. is a complete wimp. If you notice, Marty's eyes are blue and his son's are brown, a decision that was made to better distinguish between the two. They throw Marty Jr. behind the counter, and the real Marty pops back up to Griff's surprise. And I love his face in this scene. Just the shock that, like, Marty's okay. It's priceless. Marty and Griff get into it, and Griff baits him by calling him a chicken as this, like, expandable baseball bat raises behind his back. Griff smashes the simulacrum of Reagan, and as Marty approaches, Griff gets taller. Now, is this his bionic implant? I always wondered that. Now that, I remember Doc saying that his bionic implant, I wonder if it was, something in him that made him taller. I never put that together.
See, when I thought he said bionic implant, I thought, it was like a figure of speech, like, when someone says, oh, they're a couple of screwdrivers short of a toolbox. What you're saying also makes a lot more sense.
I don't know. I always think of like bionic limbs, like arms and legs. So the fact that he just kind of like got taller, like to me, that speaks to he had like bionic legs or something. You know what I mean? Now, Marty kicks and pushes Griff out of the way and into the others before running out, and the hoverboard chase ensues. Like in part 1, Marty takes the hoverboard from a kid, a girl this time, and he sees that it has a Mattel logo on it. I thought that this girl looked a lot like a young Jeanette McCurdy, but the actress's name is Lindsay Berry. So I know time-wise she would have been too young for this, but it really looks like her in my opinion.
It does, but that would have also made Jeanette like 20 when she did iCarly.
Now the hoverboard is pink and very like Barbie looking. The hoverboards were originally supposed to be made by Swatch, and I'm not sure why the decision was made to switch to Mattel. I'm sure it was some kind of licensing deal or something like that.
Commercialism.
Kids actually reached out to Mattel to ask how to get a hoverboard, after Zemeckis said on the film's behind-the-scenes featurette that hoverboards were real, but not yet released due to parental concerns regarding safety. The kids were really disappointed to learn that it was just a joke.
And it was the first lesson, kids, that the world is lying to you.
Thomas Wilson says that he often gets questions about the hoverboard and how it worked. There have been many attempts to make a hoverboard over the years, but nothing has really been practical. In one of the prior scripts for the movie, they were going to have Marty run up the side of the building to escape Griff, as his sneakers were supposed to have grips on the bottom that would help him scale a building. I'm really glad they abandoned that for the hoverboard. To me, it just would have been too hokey. And that's funny because you're comparing it to a hoverboard, which doesn't exist. But I think there's just something special about that chase. And it would not have been the same if he just climbed the side of the building,
It's supposed to be a futuristic, almost shot-for-shot remake of the first one. When you said that, I thought of, it would have made it look like Spider-Man. Not even like MCU Spider-Man, or not even like Tobey Maguire like the old animated TV show Spider-Man. It just would have taken all of the suspense out of it.
Filming the hoverboard scene was a bit challenging, as you can imagine. The actors were on harnesses attached to piano wires to move around on the hoverboard. Some of them had their shoe screwed to the board so that it would be more stable. Michael J. Fox is actually riding a real skateboard during shots of him in this scene from the knee up, and he's skating along this plywood track to simulate easy gliding. He said that he had to relearn balancing on a skateboard, and he noted that this was one of the early symptoms of his Parkinson's disease, which would be diagnosed 2 years later. On the hoverboard, Marty almost takes out a couple people, and he flips and he falls, while the goons on their hoverboards are chasing him. Of course, he does his signature move of using the back of a truck to move faster. Old Biff comments that there's something really familiar about all this. Now, Biff comes out of the diner, and my question here is, it's way later. Like, where the fuck are you? Like, what were you doing in the diner this whole time?
Listen, he was just enjoying a pop.
Enjoying a Pepsi Perfect? Biff busts out his own hoverboard, the Pit Bull. Now, they were going to name it Mad Dog after his character in part 3, but they decided against it. If you notice, he has these horns on his shoes that really nicely complement that like metal looking like colander thing that was supposed to be his helmet on his head. Now, Marty gets stuck over the pond on his hoverboard, which I have to say, it's just beautiful. The landscaping that they did with the pond there, I just thought it looked really neat. And his hoverboard doesn't have any power. Biff and the goons come after him, yelling, "Batter up." And I hated Biff so much in this scene. Like, he's just so detestable, but I mean, that's the point. They miss Marty and crash into the courthouse. The girl in Griff's group actually had an accident during this scene, and she crashed into one of the concrete pillars, smashing both of her wrists and bones in her face. So that seemed pretty dangerous, honestly.
I mean, I understand there's only a certain amount of ways you can do that scene, but don't they have stunt people?
I think this is something either you mentioned earlier or in part one, that they were kind of flying by the seat of their pants with some of this. And I think that they maybe put the actors in a little more danger than they should have or could have. Now, Marty is soaked, but his self-drying jacket takes care of that. Vacuum tubes were attached to the jacket to make it appear self-drying. He then encounters an older gentleman who wants to save the clock tower, recounting how lightning struck it now over 60 years ago. A hologram pops up announcing the Cubs winning the World Series as they swept Miami. Miami didn't have a team yet as of 1989, and they played their first season as a team in 1993. Zemeckis was a longtime Cubs fan, so that's why they chose the Cubs to win the World Series. This is also where Marty gets the idea for the sports betting based on future knowledge. He goes to the antique store and buys the almanac, at which point Old Biff sees Doc return with a DeLorean and two different Martys. Doc now has Einstein with him, saying that he was in a suspended animation kennel to explain why he was not in the time machine earlier. Marty and Doc see that the newspaper headline changes to "Gang Jailed, Hoverboard Destroys Courthouse. Gang Leader, I Was Framed." Now, there is a USA Today flying camera that takes the photo for the cover of the newspaper. I really love Biff's stupid face in that photo. I just think that's priceless.
"I was framed," said guy who flew into courthouse.
I know. Like, who else was it? It was you. Like, everybody saw it was you. It's just so stupid.
Zemeckis, Griff going into the courthouse, the first false flag operation.
They think that the problem is solved until they see Jennifer with two cops who identify her by sensor ID, noting that it's a hell of a good facelift for her age. They load her in the car and take her home. One of the female cops was actually Zemeckis' wife at the time, Mary Ellen Trainor. Now, in this scene, you also see a little moving trash can goes by that says "Litterbug" on it. I just thought that was so cute. It's so tiny and adorable, and I wish we had those.
What a catty line. "Oh, that's a hell of a good face. People can age gracefully."
It is a bit catty, I agree with you. They need to go to Marty's home to get Jennifer, but they are risking Marty and Jennifer coming face to face with their older selves. Doc says that Jennifer will either pass out or it will alter the space-time continuum and destroy the world. So, two very different outcomes.
Either way, I'm sure it'll be fine.
Doc then finds the almanac that Marty bought and tells him not to profit from the time machine. He throws it away, only for Old Biff to intercept it, who is listening in on their conversation, and then follows them back to the McFly house. Jennifer is bewildered when the cops drop her off and realizes she's in the future. She hides in a closet to avoid being seen. I do have to point out the scenery channel window. I thought that was really cool, and I kind of want one of those. Like, that would be really neat to have in your home.
Get on this, Samsung. You have enough money. Figure this out. Also, too, like, for God's sakes, Jennifer's a person. They're using her as the fucking guinea pig canary in a coal mine here in every single situation. Just leave her here, it'll be fine. As long as she doesn't go into shock, she'll be fine.
Marty's daughter, Marlene, who is also played by Michael J. Fox, answers the door, and it's George and Lorraine. As I mentioned earlier, George is hanging upside down due to a back injury. Lorraine mentions Marty's car accident 30 years ago when he hit a Rolls Royce. Now we see this scene play out at the end of part 3. She explains that it was the chain of events that ruined his life, by hurting his hand and ruining his music career. Marty Sr. comes home and is greeted by the electronic voice saying, "Lord of the Manor, King of the Castle," which is a neat way to be greeted. We also see that he's wearing 2 ties, which is apparently the style in 2015. Outside, Marty and Doc walk away from the time machine and old Biff steals it. My question is, how did he know how to drive the time machine and how it worked? Like, you do see him kind of like crash into the trash cans a little bit, but like still. Back at the McFly home, they're having Pizza Hut for dinner, which was really always a cool scene to me as a kid. I love Pizza Hut. So this was, as a kid, was really like a neat little product placement.
I love it less so that the dehydrated pizza showed up on my Instagram feed 2 days after I watched Back to the Future Part 2 as a sponsored link on Amazon. And I remember sending that to you. I'm like, how did this happen?
Lorraine puts the mini pizza in a Black & Decker food dehydrator, and in seconds, it comes out as a normal-sized pizza. It does look really fake, though, I have to say, and even watching it back, I'm like, I don't know if I would eat that, 1, and 2, it doesn't really look like a Pizza Hut pizza to me.
It looks like one of those like Stouffer's French bread pizzas that they just stuffed into a microwave. Like, if you're gonna get frozen pizza, at least get a Tombstone, like the one that used to come in like the big round box.
Now, Marty Jr. asks for fruit that drops down from the ceiling in something that's called the Garden Center. I also wanted one of those. Like, that's pretty cool to just have, fresh fruit just like drop down from the ceiling. I like that. In this scene, you have Michael J. Fox playing Marty Sr., Marty Jr., and his daughter Marlene all in one scene, which special effects wise was a huge deal at the time. Marty Sr. takes a call from a colleague, Needles, who is played by Flea from the Red Hot Chili Peppers. He really freaked me out. As a kid in this movie, he just looks very menacing. I didn't know that he was a member of the Red Hot Chili Peppers at the time. And I really hated this character. And Jennifer, if you notice, she says the name Needles as she's kind of like spying on all this. Almost like she knows who this is. Like, we're supposed to know who this is, but we don't. He's never mentioned in part 1. So I thought that was a little odd.
Is he supposed to be like Needles of the Newport Needles? This is like some member of high society.
A cool little thing is how the video call lists stats about Needles. It has his bio on screen. So his occupation, his age and birthday, his address, his hobbies. He's an avid basketball fan. His wife and children, and the sports that he does. Jogging, tennis, and you guessed it, slam ball. So that's the reference that comes back from when it was in the newspaper.
Sadly, it does not mention how many times he was shirtless on stage.
It also mentions that his politics is none and that he likes both scotch and beer. Needles tries and succeeds to get Marty to do an illegal deal. You can see Needles looking up to the side before ending the call, and he has this like sly little smile on his face. So it's like you're supposed to think that somebody else was listening in and he was really baiting Marty, which he was. Marty's boss, Ito Fujitsu, comes on screen and fires him, sending him multiple faxes noting that. Thought it was a little excessive with the faxes.
At that point, you're just, that's like a public spanking. You already said you're fired and it showed up on screen that you're fired. You don't need the faxes.
Marty's boss was of Japanese origin, as they thought that Japan would be the #1 superpower in the future. Doc is outside the window and tells young Jennifer to go to the front door and open it by pressing her thumb to the plate. Jennifer sees her older self on her way out and passes out, but Doc grabs her. Biff comes back with the time machine and breaks off a part of his cane in the car. He looks like he's in pain and dying, and there is a deleted scene that explains this a little bit further. Biff completely disappears because when he went back in time, his actions broke his own space-time continuum. Now, I'm going to explain that a little bit more in a bit. Doc says that he's going to destroy the time machine, though he references the desire to go to the Old West, foreshadowing part 3. And I want to note that the date that Biff traveled to was still on the destination keyboard, but neither Doc or Marty noticed that. So that's a really key detail that they could have picked up on, but
For the type of work that they're doing, they're not exactly detail oriented. You don't notice the DeLorean's gone. You leave Jennifer all over the place like she's a piece of luggage.
they travel back to 1985 and are almost hit by a plane while in the air. We can see clues when they go back that something is off. The trash is piled up, there are abandoned cars everywhere, and bars on the windows of homes. They just leave Jennifer at her house outside on the swing, and it's like they're just kind of hoping that something will work itself out. I really like how you reference that she's like a piece of luggage because that's what it feels like.
Basically, the two most uttered lines in this movie are, "She'll be fine," and "I messed up."
We see the Lion Estate sign has graffiti all over it, with wild dogs running around the neighborhood, and multiple for sale signs on the homes from Biff Co. Realty. At what used to be his home, Marty sees that the gate is locked, but he climbs over it and climbs in the bedroom window of what is now a little girl's room. He scares her, and her dad comes in and chases him out with a baseball bat. So this was supposed to be very similar to how that 1950s family tried to shoot him and run him off the farm. So I see the parallel there, yeah.
Yes, but this one was much less comedic. The first one, they're yelling at him, "You mutated son of a bitch!"
As Marty walks around, he sees what a nightmare Hill Valley has become. More abandoned cars and chalk outlines. I had to look this up because I didn't think it was a thing that they did, but in real life, chalk outlines are done, not very often, but it's not to help the investigation. It's just good for the media to get a front page story, and it really could contaminate evidence, so I think that's why they don't really do it, but I thought this was more of like a Hollywood trope, a movie trope.
It turns out it's a TV news trope.
Marty confirms that it's 1985 by a newspaper on a porch that turns out to be Principal Strickland's. He confronts Marty wearing armor over his PJs and holding a shotgun, commenting that Marty looks like a slacker. He tells Marty that the school burned down 6 years ago as some kids drive by shooting at him. As Marty continues into town, we see the unhoused gentleman again, and Marty calls him Red, I think for Red Thomas. Now, I'm really confused because we talked about this in part 1, and a lot of fans think this was the former mayor, Red Thomas, but Gail said very distinctly that they're two different characters. So now I'm really fucked up. Like, I don't know what this guy's supposed to be or who this guy's supposed to be.
If it is him, why don't they explain how he became unhoused? And if it's not him, like...
Yeah, I don't really understand it either. We see that the clock tower is now Biff's hotel and casino, the Pleasure Paradise, with a sign that says, "Welcome, bikers." Another sign says, "Smoking is required if going inside."
Hauling ass and hauling darts.
You see bikers rolling up to the hotel and tanks rolling in the streets. Evil and greed has taken over Hill Valley because Biff has somehow changed the rules. Gail said that this alternate Biff was based on Donald Trump. Marty approaches the casino and you see this wax statue of Biff and a video playing from the Biff Tannen Museum that explains things. The video calls him Hill Valley's #1 citizen and America's greatest living folk hero. It seems a bit of a stretch.
See, kids, even idiots can become pit bosses.
They reference Buford Mad Dog Tannen, one of his ancestors, and it's also another foreshadow to part 3. They also mention how Biff won a ton of money through sports betting, giving him another nickname of the luckiest man on earth. He also founded Biff Co., legalized gambling, dated Marilyn Monroe, supposedly, and then married Lorraine in 1973. She very much looks like a hostage in this video. Marty, horrified, backs up into the goons. One of them, which is still played by Billy Zane, finally has his first line of the movie, and they knock him out. Marty wakes up like in part 1 with Lorraine there, and now she is a different version of her 1985 self with very prominent breast implants. Biff storms in and says that Marty is supposed to be in Switzerland at boarding school. We learn that he is bankrolling her kids and clarifies that they are still her and George's kids. We can also see that she is an alcoholic again in this version of 1985. Biff pushes her down and sucker punches Marty. She agrees to stay with him when he threatens to cut off her kids. We learn that Linda has a lot of debts, Dave is on probation, and Uncle Joey is still behind bars. Now, Linda was supposed to be a sex worker in this movie, but the actress was pregnant at the time, so they really didn't think that that would be a good look, and I think that was the right choice. As Biff leaves, Lorraine reveals to Marty that George is dead. Marty goes to the cemetery to see George's grave and that he died in 1973. It also notes that he was born on April 1st, a detail that was added to hint that his life was a joke. Doc shows up to let Marty know that he knows as well. They go back to Doc's and see the newspaper headline that George was murdered, and they also referenced him as a local author. The theory is that George was shot because he continued to stand up to Biff. Doc relates this version of Hill Valley to hell, and I think he's pretty accurate on that one. Doc shows on a blackboard how the alternate 1985 timeline happened, and tells Marty that he found the almanac bag and Biff's cane in the car, and he put together what happened. They see a photo of young Biff from 1958 after he made his first winning bet, and the almanac is in his back pocket. Marty says he stole my idea and realizes that this version of the timeline is his fault.
Marty's not the reason that Biff finds out about the time machine.
No, but he puts the idea of the almanac in his head. So I get why he thinks that that is his fault, but it's not his fault that he stole the time machine and went back in time to give young Biff the almanac.
Yeah, and it's not his fault that Biff is hiding behind the door when they're discussing the time machine. But honestly, Marty fucks up in a lot more different ways and worse ways than just buying the almanac.
Doc explains that they can't go to the future to stop it, because the future will be of this reality and not the old reality. He also shows the newspaper headline that Doc is in an asylum in this timeline. Another headline is Nixon seeks fifth term. So, yikes. They need to find out when Biff got the almanac so they can go into the past and get it. Marty returns to Biff's hotel where he's in a hot tub with two girls, and Marty says, "Party's over, Biff." I love that line. And that they need to talk about the almanac. In Biff's office, he explains how he got it. An old guy showed up one day claiming that they're related, shows him the almanac that has the outcome of every sporting event until the end of the century. He says that there's no catch to it and to keep it a secret. He never saw the old guy again. As Biff is talking, Marty takes a matchbook, and Biff said that the old guy warned him, if someday a crazy wild-eyed scientist or a kid shows up asking about it, he implied that Biff should kill them. Biff says, "I never thought it'd be you."
But why does Biff tell them about it?
Because I think he assumes that he's going to kill Marty in this moment, so it doesn't matter. Biff tries to shoot him as Marty runs out, and I have to say that he's a really bad shot. Like, he takes a couple of shots at him as Marty's running away, and it's like, you're not too good with that gun, my friend.
You know, when you're a big pit boss in a very, very, very small bowl, shooting's not one of the things you have to get good at.
Marty encounters and evades the goons by hopping over the stairs to change direction and go to the roof.
It was a really smooth action move, and I have no choice but to stand it.
It was really genius, I agree. Now, Biff sees that the roof door is open, and he goes up there too. Biff urges him to jump or he'll shoot him with the same gun that was used to kill his dad. 2 McFlys with the same gun. Marty calmly steps off the roof to Biff's surprise, only to find Marty standing on the time machine and Biff gets knocked out by the door. This is arguably one of the best scenes in the movie. Just the sequence on this and how calmly he does it. It's just like such a good moment. I don't know. I've always really loved that.
And it reinforces how much of an idiot Biff is.
Yes. Marty tells Doc once he gets back in the time machine that they have to go back to 1955. Now, 2 things before we leave this scene. To kind of tie up Biff's timeline and why in that deleted scene he was disappearing, Zemeckis and Gale explain that Lorraine shoots Biff in the year 1996 in this timeline, which explains Biff dying and disappearing in this deleted scene. Now, they don't give any more context as to why or why 1996, but there was one interview that I saw that this was their explanation to why Biff is appearing in pain and dying when he returns in 2015.
I would have thought actually that it was like what was happening to Marty in Back to the Future 1, that because he was changing the past, he was fading away.
I never put it together as a kid that might be what was happening. I just thought he hurt himself somewhere along the line in this journey back to 1955 and back to 2015. But watching it as an adult, I'm like, oh, okay, that's why. Now, the DeLorean was held in the air in this scene with wires, and the movements were carefully choreographed. Zemeckis says that any and all special effects were used in Part 2 to make the DeLorean fly, but he would never reveal any specific details on how they did it. What we do know is some of the shots of the DeLorean in Part 2 were used from miniature versions. So I thought it was interesting that he wouldn't give away the secrets of how they did this with DeLorean, but
We also might have used Hot Wheels.
I think it's fine now to maybe say something or comment on how they did that. I mean, I guess back then, yeah, he wanted to keep trade secrets and the special effects to himself, I guess. But I don't know, like now, really, it's been, 30 some years since this movie, but.
Well, also, too, I think at this point, all this is so just old hat. It's not like you've cornered the market on this.
When going back to 1955, Doc notes that the year could be the temporal junction for the space-time continuum, or it's just a coincidence. He does these 2 extreme ends of the spectrum with things a lot of the time.
Well, and also, too, Christopher Lloyd, his performance allows that to land. A lot of other actors, that complete cut, just opposite ends of the line, would not be able to land as well as it does.
We see that the DeLorean destination keypad is malfunctioning and needs tweaking. He tells Marty that Jennifer and Einstein will be fine. Again, as you mentioned, it's really dismissive, and there's not a lot of care or worry or thought to what is going to happen to them. In 1955, they park the time machine where they did before, behind the Lion Estate sign, as the other DeLorean had already been moved by Marty and Doc. Marty must track down Biff and not interfere with the handoff of the almanac so that old Biff returns to 2015. Doc gives Marty binoculars and a walkie-talkie and warns that there are now 2 versions of each of them in this time point. He gives Marty cash to get clothes from a briefcase full of money for different years. Now, if you look closely, there are 2 slots for the year of 1884. This is because of the Civil War, and there were 2 forms of currency back then, one for the Union and one for the Confederacy. So I really loved that historically accurate detail. I thought that was really cool.
That's a great little thing, and a great filmmaker will find ways to do those little things very well.
Doc tells Marty to dress in something inconspicuous, and he gets a jacket, a hat, and sunglasses. So not inconspicuous at all. Marty is at Biff's home, owned by his grandma, Gertrude Tannen. We see all these lawn ornaments and 2 signs. One says, "No trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted. This means you." And "Keep off the grass." So very welcoming into Grandma Tannen's yard. Unsurprisingly, Biff is kind of a dick to his grandma, and he leaves to go pick up his car from the manure in part 1. They clean that up. On his way, he picks up a ball that some kids are playing with, and he taunts them and throws it on a roof. And it really just shows like what a bully he is. A bully is a bully, but I think it's one thing to bully people your own age and then to bully kids that are like 15 years, 10 years younger than you. You know what I mean? It's a little different, but again, not great, but this is just, I think, a little cruel to these kids. And these kids were so cute.
It shows how good Wilson's performance is. He can pull off being such a convincing dickhead. He plays it so well.
Great job, Thomas Wilson. Marty follows Biff into town, where we hear the song Sandman playing again, like we did in the first one. Marty is ducking around cars to avoid him, and old Biff is seen behind a tree waiting to talk to young Biff. As young Biff argues with Terry, the guy who fixed his car, over the price, Marty hops in the back seat. Biff returns and throws cans of oil in the back seat that land right on Marty, who is hiding under a blanket. So, like, you feel that pain in that moment when they're thrown on top of him.
And those cans of oil are not light.
Biff sees Lorraine admiring her dress for the dance and goes over to talk to her. The costume department actually got rid of Lorraine's dress after wrapping the first movie, as they didn't think that there would be a sequel. Leah Thompson actually still had one of the dresses made for the original movie at home, and she brought that in for them to use, which is where this dress came from. Biff harasses her, says that she should go to the dance with him, but she tells him that she's going with Calvin Klein, or Marty. She runs off as he tells her that they're going to get married someday. And I always thought it was a really neat thing to see this alternative scene from 1955 that we didn't see in the first one, in the first timeline. It just... Again, it's kind of a nod to the audience. Like, you know this world, you know these characters. We're going to show you a little something extra that you didn't see before, you know?
It was a really nice touch, and it really gives the second movie importance.
Biff comes back to the car to find old Biff in the driver's seat, who says, "I can help you marry her." Old Biff starts the car, to young Biff's surprise, and says, "I'm the only one that can start it." The 2 Biffs go back to his grandma's as old Biff is driving like really erratically, and he takes out part of a bush. He parks in the garage and tries to explain to young Biff about the almanac. You see Marty briefly pop up from the back seat behind old Biff. Young Biff is dismissive of what old Biff is saying and the almanac, telling him, "Make like a tree and get out of here." Old Biff slaps him on the back of the head, saying, "It's leave. You sound like a damn fool when you say it wrong."
It's really funny because it's the only time in the entire movie that Biff says something logical or smart, or even clever. It's the one time in the movie where he uses his brain.
I like that he kind of takes the opportunity to like correct himself, because you know the way he says it, you can tell that that's something that he hated in his younger self that he did, that he got this wrong. So it's just interesting to see that interaction. Old Biff turns on the radio to show young Biff how the almanac predicts the score of the UCLA game. Young Biff starts to get it, but throws the almanac in the back seat. Old Biff tries to explain how precious this is and to get a safe. They walk off and lock Marty in the garage, still in the back seat of Biff's car. Marty calls Doc to let him know that he's trapped, and Doc needs to get over there to help get him out. Later, we see Biff leaving for the dance, and he yells at his grandma again. Doc shows up on a bike to find that Marty is already gone from the garage. And he still has a tag on his hat, and he just rips it off, which I remember, but it was just something that I forgot, and I really liked from that scene. Marty radios Doc from the moving car, And I always had to question, like, how does Biff not hear this? Like, he's not 50 feet behind him. He's in the back seat. So how do you not hear him on the walkie-talkie?
I have a theory because of alternate timelines that we're like a Patrick Swayze ghost situation where only Doc can hear Marty, because it's absolutely unbelievable. He's having a full conversation and he's like almost leaning on the front seats of the car, like having a full conversation. How does he not see or hear, or even just in his peripherals, see the actual human being in his rearview mirror sitting in his back seat?
He briefly talks with Doc, who reminds him not to let him see his other self, just as Doc encounters his other self, setting up the wires for the DeLorean to go back to 1985 from part 1. Doc's other self asks him for a wrench, when future Doc corrects him on the wrench size and they talk about the storm. I always wondered, how does he not recognize himself? They have an interaction, they look very similar. 1955 Doc knows that time travel is possible. Like, that wasn't super believable to me.
Why did that not alter his space-time continuum?
Well, because he didn't recognize himself. If he had, then yeah, I think that would have caused a problem. Now, as he rides away, you can also see that his bike still has a tag on it too, so that was a nice touch. At the dance, Biff parks and quickly comes back to grab the almanac from the car. Marty heads into the dance and spots George dancing by himself, waiting for his cue to go to the parking lot. Again, I want to mention how I'm just so impressed by these decorations. Like, they really, really did this well. And I also want to say that some random inconspicuous dude walking through a dance, it doesn't raise any concern for anybody. Like, who is this guy? Where did he come from? What does he want? You know, it's just, that was a little weird. Marty then sees Biff and the goons spiking the punch and looking at a dirty magazine. Strickland catches Biff and follows him outside, where him and the goons are plotting to find old Marty. Marty also spots himself outside pulling up with his mom from part 1. Strickland comes up to Biff as Marty tries to grab the almanac from Biff's back pocket. He smells liquor on him, to which Biff replies, "I'm too young to drink," in this very, like, rude and sarcastic way. Like, he's such a dick. Strickland takes the almanac and calls him a slacker, of course. Marty follows Strickland back to his office, and he hides from his other self in the car as he goes by, which was, again, I think really, it was just really cool, like the choreograph to that, as he like slides on the side of the car and you can see him and his mom in the car from part 1. Like, I thought that was pretty genius. Inside the school, you see S.S. Strickland on the door to his office, and that was supposedly speaking to his totalitarian role. Now, in the Back to the Future video game, it later reveals that it's just Strickland's initials. Marty sneaks into the office and he moves that flag that's on the desk to reach for the almanac, but the door shuts and startles Strickland. Strickland sits back down and catches Marty's hand between the desk and the chair, and you can see him do the silent scream. Like, you just feel it in that moment, like how much that hurts. And I think Michael J. Fox just acted that so beautifully.
I've done that before. That hurts like a son of a gun.
Now, Strickland throws away the almanac and leaves. Marty retrieves it, only to find that it's the dirty magazine and not actually the almanac. Marty realizes his opportunity to get the almanac from Biff after he remembers that George knocks him out. Marty sees the punch and sees himself witnessing it too, saying, "Talk about deja vu." Marty runs over to Biff, saying that he knows CPR, but the guy's kind of confused because CPR was not invented until 1960. He punches Biff again as he's coming to and takes the almanac and runs off. The wallet guy, as I like to call him, accuses Marty of taking Biff's wallet. I also need to mention that he looks like he's about 45 years old. So it's like, what are you doing here? You're supposed to be a high school student, but you look like you're 45.
The narkiest narc that's ever narked. Your wallet, he went that way and he has your wallet. Your wallet's gone.
He is a narc.
And the best part is he's telling this to a guy who probably would have stuffed him into a lock, who probably did stuff him into a locker like last week.
Marty radios Doc to tell him that he got the almanac and they plan to meet on the roof of the school gym. But he runs into the goons and is able to knock them over. Doc, meanwhile, is on his way with the time machine, but he bumps into the Lion Estates sign, which malfunctions the destination keypad, setting it to January 1st, 1885. Back in the gym, George and Lorraine kiss, and if you look closely, you can see the prosthetics on Jeffrey Wiseman's face. It's very shiny and like it protrudes a little bit from his cheek. Like, if I didn't know what I know now about the replacement of the actor and the prosthetics, like I never noticed this before, but now having that knowledge, I'm like, yep, there it is. There's the prosthetics.
You don't notice it until you notice it, and then once you notice it, it looks like silly putty.
The goons enter the gym chasing Marty and are confused about how he got up on stage and changed his clothes so fast. So they're pretty dumb. This is during the Johnny Be Good performance, which Michael J. Fox had to reshoot because of the different angles. He did make a comment in one interview that the second time around, a couple years later, it was a little bit harder on his body, sliding on his knees, and he said it was a little bit of a different experience the second time around.
You know, even when you're 25, that's not fun. You're sliding on your knees. Even if for someone who is in peak physical condition, which is not me, that's still a lot of weight that's being absorbed by your knees as you land on a hard surface. That's not pleasant.
Now, Marty needs to ensure that his other self isn't attacked by the goons so he can get back to the time machine on time and avoid a time paradox. You see Marty like nod in approval watching his other self, like impressed by the music, and I've always loved that little detail. The goons are waiting on the other side for Marty to come off stage after the song, but you can also see that they're jamming along too to the music. In the parking lot, Biff comes to, and the wallet guy again says that Marty stole his wallet as Biff runs into the school.
He's got your wallet. He's got your wallet. This guy's a fucking parrot.
Even as a kid, when I used to watch these movies, I fucking hated that guy. There was just something about him. I'm like, I hate you, dude.
This is the fucking guy who like reminds the professor that there's homework to give out.
Yes, exactly. Marty climbs the catwalk above the stage and drops sandbags on the goons twice and runs off. Marty sees his other self talking to George and Lorraine at the end. And again, if you look closely, you can tell that it's not Crispin Glover as George, but a part of the scene is blurred, so it's supposed to kind of conceal the actor. Biff shows up next to Marty outside, encouraging a fight, when Marty is knocked out with a door by his other self. Biff sees that there are two Martys and that he also has the almanac. Biff kicks him twice in the stomach and leaves with the almanac. Marty finds Doc on the roof and catches up to them as they go to find Biff to try to get the almanac back again. Now, I think we talked about this a little bit. It's similar to the scene in part 1 where Doc is trying to reconnect the wires and it's like 2 and 3 times things fall apart. It's the same thing with the almanac. Like, if you cut this back a little bit, I think it would have been a little bit more maybe believable, palatable. I don't know what the word is, but it's a redundant. It just seems a little too redundant, like reconnecting the wires in part 1.
It comes off as hackneyed. You didn't really need it. You didn't need to have the wallet guy. You didn't really need that. You could have just had him hold on to it until the end and then gone right into what we're going to get into.
I would have been really happy if the wallet guy was not included in this movie, but I'm glad you agree. It just felt redundant. But like I said, I felt that in part 1 a little bit too.
That's the one part that feels like empty calories. 2, 4, 5 minutes of the movie that could have just been cut.
They catch up to Biff, flying above him in the DeLorean. Marty suggests landing on him, but Doc says, a 46 Ford versus a DeLorean? he'll rip us like tinfoil, which was a really nice little line there because historically, and I looked a little bit more into the story of DeLorean and John DeLorean and the company, and he got into some shady things. I'm just going to leave that there. But it was also, as I mentioned in part one, it was very poorly made. It was very cheap, did not run well. So compared to a Ford from the 40s, yeah, it stood no chance.
Ford, at least we're not a DeLorean.
Marty gets out to follow Biff on the hoverboard, which is still in the car from 2015, and a chase ensues. Now, the choreography of this scene is just amazing. And one of my favorite parts is when Marty opens the passenger door to grab the almanac and Biff sees him, like, completely surprised. They enter the tunnel, which is the same tunnel that takes you to Toontown in Roger Rabbit. Biff almost kills him a few times before Marty does this, like, cartwheel move over the front of the car to get the almanac. Biff chases him back through the tunnel, but Doc saves Marty at the last second at the end of the tunnel. And he really does get some speed on that hoverboard. Now, Biff crashes into the manure truck again at the same angle and says, "I hate manure," after spitting some out of his mouth, which is so gross. But Thomas Wilson confirmed that it was not real manure that he spit out. So, in case anybody was wondering. Now, there is a fan theory that Marty actually died in this chase, and that Doc had to go back in time to save him, and that's why it is so perfectly timed at the end. What do you think about that theory?
The just-in-time trope is so established in Hollywood. You don't need a theory to be like, oh, the hero got saved just in time.
Marty and Doc go back to the Lion Estate sign, and Doc says that he needs to land in a certain way because of the storm. Marty then burns the almanac, and again, my question is, how did he get the match lit with, like, the wind of the storm? But again, I'm putting too much logic to this. And you can still see next to him that the hoverboard is still hovering. The matchbook changes back to auto detailing from the Pleasure Paradise, and the newspaper headline changes to George McFly honored and Emmett Brown commended. Also, that we see the headline change to Reagan to seek a second term instead of Nixon seeking a fifth term. Just then, lightning strikes the time machine and it disappears. Marty thinks Doc is dead at first, and it starts raining and this car pulls up with this really intimidating man driving. Now, what did you think of this guy? Because until you know what he's there for, he's very, like you said, he's very intimidating. He's very, I don't know, you almost think that he's there to arrest him or that Marty's in trouble for some reason.
I thought he was the fuzz. Like, I thought he was like a federal agent that had found out about time travel. Now, like, President Eisenhower's trying to keep it quiet. That's what I thought. I thought he was like CIA.
I do want to say, too, I always thought it was odd the way this scene played out with Doc and the DeLorean disappearing. I don't know. It didn't quite make sense of, like, why he couldn't land the DeLorean. I wish they would have explained that a little bit better. Like, if you look at Marty's face, too, even during the scene before Doc disappears, it's like he kind of looks befuddled. Like, what are you doing?
Why is this giant car with jets on it floating in the air like a balloon? When you haven't had this problem before, and when you literally were able to fly underneath a 747 jet, when you go back to the original timeline, when you think like being in the wake of that would have completely wrecked your jet stream.
That's a good point. I never thought of relating it to how they traveled in 2015, but you're right. Yeah, why was it such a problem now?
This feels like one of the things that they tried to force in order to set up the third movie. When I talk about there are parts of this that seem forced to because they need a way to get the plot to a certain place they need it to be, whether it's to advance it in this movie or to set up the third movie. Honestly, the ending is somewhat unsatisfying because it just seems so forced and a little bit unbelievable.
I mean, the ending definitely, I think, was purely to set up part 3. So I do see that. And that they were written like back to back. It That's definitely what it was. So yeah, I think on its own, yeah, it was an unsatisfying ending.
The ending was written like it was all one movie. The ending makes more sense if it's either all one movie or if you're watching it immediately afterwards.
Like I said in the beginning, Zemeckis and Gale wrote this to be one movie at first.
Yeah.
So, and I guess they didn't change it too much. So I guess that makes sense. But yeah, I feel like the end of 3 is more fulfilling than this for sure. Now we find out that the guy that drives up in the car is from Western Union with a letter from 1885. Marty reads the letter. And again, in this scene, this is just my own anxieties coming in. But as the rain's pouring down and the paper is getting wet, I'm just like, I always get a little anxious because it's like the ink's going to run and you're not going to know what it says, but it's fine. And it says that Doc is fine and that he's in 1885. Western Union guy asks Marty if he needs help, to which Marty says, "There's only one man who can help me." Marty goes back to where Doc is when he sent Marty back in part 1, just to find Doc celebrating the success. Marty runs up to him and explains that he's back from the future. Doc says his famous line, "Great Scott," before he passes out. And the movie ends with the note, "To be concluded." And then we see the trailer for part 3.
Once they kind of decided that these were going to be two separate movies, I do kind of wish they would have altered the endings a little bit.
I think I would have liked it better if it was more of a standalone ending to part 2. And not saying the beginning of part 3, you could have gone back kind of like they did at the beginning of part 2 and kind of reference that and then tweak something for the plot. I don't know. I agree with you. As much as I love part 2, I don't love the ending. Now, a couple of points before we wrap up the episode. So Zemeckis and Gale said that they will never make a sequel. They will never do a reboot. They will never put out another version of Back to the Future in any capacity, at least as long as they're still alive. They really think that 3 is a nice number, and they really told the story the way they wanted to tell it. So everybody begging for part 4 or a reboot or anything like that, it's never going to happen.
Well, I think the way it's written too, there's really only so many things you can do. You can't keep fucking around with the past and the future, because what has to happen is the more you do it, the more outlandish kind of ways you have to find. You have to write yourself out of it. In a couple of places, they kind of overwrote and they kind of wrote themselves into a logical corner. Like, after all of this, where's Jennifer?
You find that in part 3. But I do get what you're saying. It's very unfulfilling with her still kind of being in limbo in this alternate 1985, but it is wrapped up nicely in part 3. And I think that this trilogy is so iconic by itself that, yeah, if you added to it, if you did a reboot, it wouldn't do it justice. It would never reach the caliber of the first 3, in my opinion.
Will there probably be a reboot at some point because studios just want to print money? Yeah, there probably will be, because we're getting Mean Girls reboots, and Mean Girls isn't that old.
I think there's been talk of it, and there's been a lot of the fan base asking for it. But from what I understand, Zemeckis and Gale currently own the rights to the movie. So they have guaranteed that as long as they still have the rights, there will never be another iteration of Back to the Future. Something else that I really reflected on this rewatch is how much Hill Valley is its own character, because you see it in different time points and you see it reflecting the current time and the people that live there and how it evolves over the years. And it really is kind of the silent co-star of this. And I really thought that was neat how they really made it such an important piece of the movie, you know?
Basically, the tone of the movie in a particular scene is really kind of dictated by the way the town is portrayed and what the marquee in the movie theater shows. So when the town is doing well, everything is bright and it's sunny.
I really like how the town really reflects the socioeconomic status of the people there, and just this theme of how one place can change so drastically because of that in either direction. I just thought that was really smart of the writers to kind of put in there and really make a hallmark of the movie, you know?
Well, and we talk a lot about like unintentional commentaries, and it really is kind of an unintentional commentary on American civic life, isn't it?
And what I thought was interesting too is I think it was Zemeckis in an interview talked about how in part one, they filmed the 50s version of Hill Valley first. They made it, you know, really bright and beautiful and clean. And they kind of like tore it all down for the 1985 scenes and really kind of like trashed it up and roughed it up a little bit. So I thought that was interesting, just the progression of that and how they set that up from, you know, a filmmaking perspective. My last question for you, and something that's always kind of not bothered me, but kind of like nagged at me a little bit is how do you think the future timeline would have played out under the original version of 1985? So Lorraine's an alcoholic, George is a nerd, Biff's very bullying to adult George. How do you think that future would have played out in 2015?
I think Marty would have been his biggest fear in that he's anonymous. You know, he kind of just lives his life going through the motions. Like his dad, he's so afraid of rejection. He wants desperately to have money and fame. And if he had stayed on the original timeline, I think what would have happened is I think he would have been kind of as anonymous, unnoticeable as his dad was. He would have blended into the scenery the same way his dad did.
I think too, it kind of would have been more of a depressing timeline. I honestly, and I don't mean to be grim about this, but I don't think that George and Lorraine would have made it to 2015, just like health issues or whatever. And I do think Marty would have just become like some average guy, you know, with an average job. I don't think he would have fulfilled his music career, even though he did have ambitions, you know, back in the original timeline too. But yeah, I just think it would have been a much more grim outcome.
I mean, this would have been like a Spielberg Oscar movie. It would have been a story about trying to find joy and peace and acceptance and love in little things. It would have been appreciating what you have instead of always wanting for more. And not, it's a zany time travel movie where Michael J. Fox has to ward off his horny mom. It would have changed the tenor of the movie dramatically.
So we've really enjoyed the first two installments of our movie festival. And we want to hear from you guys about if you want us to do part 3. Now, I don't love part 3. I don't love the Western theme to it. Although watching some of the clips back, it's really probably not as bad as I remember, but it's definitely my least favorite of the trilogy. So we want you guys to tell us if you want us to cover part 3, we will do that. If, you know, you're kind of over it at this point, you know, let us know either way.
Always let us know on our Gmail at the tellmeaboutpodcast@gmail.com. You can also follow us on our social media, Instagram and TikTok at the Tell Me About Podcast.
And I do, before we close, want to shout out the YouTube channel Heavy Spoilers. They provided a lot of great background info and details for this episode, so they are really great. Go check them out. So please remember to rate, review, and subscribe, and we will be back in 2 weeks with another episode from Tom.
Have a great 2 weeks, everybody.
Bye.